The cool autumn wind fled from the storm building on the west side of the valley. It was late in the day, and as the clouds gathered, Augustus Travis Baylor turned up the collar on his flannel shirt. "Gus," as he was called, said into the wind, "glad I wore the shirt. Those clouds are going to drop the temperature even more. Might be snow before morning." The heavy flannel shirt was almost a jacket, in a muted green and brown plaid. It wasn't a camo shirt, but it did a good job of letting Gus blend into the surrounding forest, and it was water-resistant. He was coming back from an unsuccessful bow hunting trip. Gus liked to hunt and fish, and most anything that got him outdoors, especially in the woods and near the streams on his own property. He enjoyed the tracking skills needed for a successful hunt or fishing trip. Gus used the meat and fish he harvested from the wild, but felt using a rifle was a cop-out. Anyone can stand off 200 or 300 yards with a high-power scoped rifle, bring down an animal, and call themselves hunters, he often argued to the gun hunting set. Try stalking to within 30 or 40 yards with a bow and bringing down the deer, elk, or whatever you're after. It gives the animal an even chance and proves how skillful you are. Gus was on his own property, which was in Missouri, situated in an area known as the Heart of the Ozarks. It was a 960-acre section and a half of land that had been in his family for more than 80 years. The land had mostly wooded hills, 3 or 4 small streams, 1 large lake, and several grassy meadows. He moved easily through the trees and brush. For a man who was 6 feet 2 inches, Gus was as quiet and stealthy as a mountain lion on the hunt. His tracking skills and movement through the woods had been learned at his father's and grandfather's knee. Gus's lean, trim build, dark eyes and hair, and his naturally light tan complexion, made even darker by outdoor exposure, told of his Native American heritage. Maybe his liking for the bow was part of that heritage. Gus smiled as he walked back to the old farmhouse, thinking of the stories about how this farm had come into the family's hands. "This place feels like a friend as well as my home," Gus thought. "More so than that apartment I have in St. Louis." Gus's great-great-grandparents had migrated north and slightly east from the West Texas plains during the Great Depression in 1935. Things had been tough in Texas, maybe more so than in the rest of the country. Not only were there no jobs, but there was also a serious drought that made farming almost impossible. The family settled in the hills of the Ozarks, where not many would notice or care that Gus's great-great-grandmother and grandmother were both full-blooded Osage Indians from the reservation in Oklahoma. The Baylors quickly set up a homestead and went about making a life. Great-great-grandpa Austin Baylor did whatever he could to feed the family. Austin knew that he needed cash to approach the bank that actually owned the land they were squatting on. He thought, considering the times, that if he could offer a good down payment, the bank would sell him the land on credit. Austin was damn certain that once he had legal title, he could make a go of the farm. There were more than a few wild cattle roaming the hills that had once belonged to others who had packed up and left, or just let the animals go because they couldn't afford to pay for winter feeding. Austin gathered a small herd of these gone back to the wild cattle, not for marketing, they were food on the hoof for his family. He took to running a trap line for pelts and fur. Austin would begin trapping in late fall when the critters had grown their winter coats, and he would stop just before the spring thaw, before they lost those heavy pelts. Money was tight, but the General Mercantile would give credit in the store for coyote, beaver, muskrat, and marten skins. Sometimes he even got cash money. Another cash crop for the Baylors was the moonshine Austin made. He had a homemade still back in a hollow, and the shine he turned out was of good quality and highly prized. Prohibition had been repealed 2 years earlier, but the Hill people couldn't, or wouldn't, pay the higher price for store-bought liquor. There was a tax on the liquor made by law-abiding distilleries, and most of the so-called Hillies didn't care for the government or their agents, the G-men. There had been more than a few confrontations between the revenue agents and the free-willed moonshiners in the valleys and hollows of the Missouri hills. The tax-free, illegal white lightning gave the Hill people a well-appreciated alternative. Finally, after a year and a half, Austin had put together a little over $400, which, for the times, was a large sum of money. He made the 2-day, 50-mile wagon trip into Vannon to buy the land and bring back some supplies to the farm. The small town, with no more than 400 people in it, was the county seat of Carter County. Austin went to talk to Theodore Barkley, the owner of the land and of the bank. "That section of land is worth more than the $2,000 you offered, Mr. Baylor," Barkley stated after hearing Austin's offer. "Why should I take less than the property is worth?" "Yes, sir, you're right," Austin replied. "That farm is probably worth more, but not right now. This depression, as the government calls it, ain't going to be over anytime soon. And how much are you making on the land right now?" "I'll give you $30 a month until the loan and interest are paid off. Seems to me it's a matter of a bird in the hand against one in the bush that you may never catch." Austin could see Barkley arguing with himself. "Look at it this way, Mr. Barkley, if I pay you a few months and then can't anymore, you can take the land back." Austin held up the $400 and added, "At least you got something out of the deal instead of the land sitting there, making you nothing." Barkley revised his first impression that Austin was just an uneducated, ignorant hill boy. The man might be right, Barkley thought. "I don't see this depression ending in the foreseeable future, in spite of the prattle the federal government is spouting," he mused, staring at Austin for about a minute. "I believe we have a deal, Mr. Baylor," Barkley said, holding out his hand for the money. "I'll just take your down payment to the vault." "Reckon I'd like a piece of paper that tells about the deal we made," Austin replied. "I'd like a receipt for the $400 as well." This man is no fool, Barkley thought. He took a piece of foolscap and handwrote 2 copies of the terms and penalties of the mortgage. He signed both contracts, got Austin's signature, and gave him a copy. "You've bought yourself a farm, Mr. Baylor." "Reckon so," Austin agreed. "See y'all next month with your payment." He left the bank, went to the General Mercantile, and got his supplies. He loaded the wagon and rode all day and most of the night back to his farm. The section and a half of land had been passed down from father to son. Gus inherited the farm from his father, Travis, 5 years earlier, when he was 27. His parents were killed by a drunk driver, and the property was willed to Gus. Travis Baylor had used the place as a hobby farm. He had electric power brought onto the farm and had the well piped into the farmhouse. Travis and his wife did a little gardening, but mostly used the old farmhouse and land as a getaway from the hustle and bustle of the city. The fields in some of the valleys were leased out to a local farmer. Gus changed that when he became the owner. He gave the farmer notice that the lease would run the current season and one more, and then would not be renewed. Gus did some major renovations on the old house, rebuilt the barn, and turned the property into a sort of hunting and fishing preserve. Topping a small rise, Gus looked down at his cabin at the tree line of a narrow valley. A light wind-blown mist had started to fall, and in the gathering dusk, the lights from the 2 windows on the rear of the cabin glowed warmly in the coming night. A column of smoke rose from the river chimney. The smile on his face turned into a full grin. "Ally must have the fireplace going," Gus thought. "Bet she's got supper on the stove too. I sure hope so, 'cause I'm hungry after my little hike." Before starting down the slope, Gus looked over the 2 valleys separated by the hill he stood on. He had a deep sense of being home. He worked in St. Louis, but his heart and his home were here, on the old farm. Gus started down the gentle slope to the valley, his grin broadening even more as he thought about how he and Ally had met. He'd gone to an outdoor sports expo on a Friday to check out some archery and fishing equipment. She had been the pretty girl promoting an outdoor sports resort. Alyssa Bod. Gus read her name tag aloud and smiled at her. His interest was more in the girl than the resort. He had his farm as his resort and needed nothing more. What he did want was to get to know Alyssa better. "Yes, sir," she said, shaking Gus's hand. "And you are?" "Forgot my manners," Gus replied. "Excuse me, I'm Augustus Baylor." "Gus to my friends." "Let me tell you about Lost Creek Resort," Alyssa began, explaining the wonders and adventures available. Lost Creek is on the shores of Greer's Ferry Lake. The resort has over 3 miles of shoreline. The property is in Arkansas, by car. We're about 2 hours north and a little east of Little Rock, and 2 hours west of Jonesboro. It's a little over 5 hours south and a little west of St. Louis. Gus didn't fully concentrate on what she was saying, but he watched her with great interest. She's tall, he thought. She's got to be 5 feet 9 inches or 10. Alyssa was athletically slender, with long auburn hair and big brown eyes. You'd have to call her handsome rather than pretty, he continued his thoughts. All in all, a very nice package. Lost Creek has 1,000 acres filled with deer, elk, turkey, and other types of wildlife. We have miles of hiking trails, float trips by canoe, kayak, or inflatable rafts on the White River, and there are also tours and fishing trips on the lake. Alyssa gave what was obviously a prepared speech, but delivered it with depth and enthusiasm. As she gave her scripted presentation, Alyssa found herself attracted to the tall, ruggedly handsome man standing in front of her. He looks like he spends more time outdoors than he does in the city, she thought. Alyssa didn't want Gus to leave just yet, so she handed him a special full-color brochure showing pictures of Lost Creek Resort. There's a voucher in there for a 20% discount, she said. Gus glanced at the brochure and handed it back to Alyssa. Miss Bod, I'm really not interested. Ally, she corrected. My friends call me Ally, she said, smiling at Gus. Why don't you want to visit Lost Creek? Alyssa asked. I have my own resort in the Ozark Hills outside of Van Buren, Gus replied. I've got almost 1,000 acres and plenty of elk, deer, and turkey on my place too. I've even got a black bear and her 2 cubs living out of a cave on a rock bluff just on the far side of my property. My place has several year-round creeks or streams and a pretty large lake. He smiled and added, You'll have to let me show it to you. Ally returned his smile. I'd have to know you a lot better before I'd go traipsing off to the backside of nowhere. We can remedy that problem, Gus said. The expo closes on Sunday. I'd like to take you to dinner, say on Monday evening. We can begin the getting to know you process. Why wait? Ally asked. I get off at 5 today. The sooner we start the process, as you call it, the sooner it will be completed. And the sooner I get to visit this resort of yours. Smiling, he said, see you at 5. That dinner led to more time together. Ally and Gus would date at least twice a week, more when Ally wasn't working an outdoor or travel expo out of town. Gus found that Ally was more than just a pretty model for Lost Creek. She had grown up on a farm on the outskirts of Columbia, Missouri, and had a master's degree in business administration and a BS in hospitality management. Her goal was to run a group of resorts like Lost Creek. Almost 3 months to the day after they met, Ally got to see what she called Gus's resort for the first time. Gus had improved and renovated the building to modern standards but kept most of the historic features. The house was a rambling 1-story structure, very much like you'd see on the West Texas plains. The building had 2 separate parts connected by a covered breezeway. Gus had built walls for this walkway with a few windows so you could get from one section of the house to the other without being exposed to bad weather. Across the breezeway, the second section of the home held a master suite, 2 additional bedrooms, and a guest bathroom. Gus seldom had visitors to the farm, but when he did, he wanted them to be comfortable. He had updated the bathrooms and plumbing. Gus had a second well dug to ensure that his house had enough fresh water, and he kept the old-time pump in the kitchen to preserve a bit of history. The main house faced west, so you could sit on the large front porch and watch the sunset from one of the 2 old-time rocking chairs. The rear of the house, with its own porch, also had 2 rocking chairs to view the sunrise over the hills to the east. This main section of the building was actually one very large open room. It contained the almost gourmet kitchen, a large eating area that still had the old farm table in it, and an area in the front of the building that was like a huge family room. Tucked against a side wall was a bathroom. Ally fell in love with the old farmhouse and the valley it sat in. The story of how the farm came into Gus's family intrigued her, and she quickly showed Gus that she was as much at home in the woods as he was, sharing a love for the outdoors. With her hair pulled back into a ponytail and little makeup, she seemed like part of the hunting party. She helped plan which expos the Lost Creek Resort would attend, along with a few other vacation places. If she wasn't doing an expo, Gus would pick her up as soon as he finished work on Friday, and they'd head out of town. It was about a 4-hour drive to the farm, the last hour from Van Buren over back roads, forest access trails, and an old path with 2 ruts marking the way to the house. The first week in November, Gus and Ally drove to the farm. The deer archery season would run 1 more week, and Gus planned to harvest a buck. Work schedules had prevented him and Ally from coming to the farm earlier in the season. Gus carried in some wood for the stove as Ally put away the supplies they had brought with them. They planned on staying for 4 or 5 days. If I get a deer the first day or 2, we'll go fishing or hiking, or just enjoy being out here away from the city, Gus told Ally. Is there a doubt that you'll get a deer? Ally asked, pretending to be shocked at the concept. Gus picked up his bow and replied, using this instead of a rifle gives the animal a better than even chance. Ally giggled and ran across the room to jump into Gus's lap. You're smart enough to make me fall in love with you, and that's good enough. That's right, Ally. I do love you, Gus said as he reached into the pocket of his jean jacket and pulled out a ring box. He opened it and held it up to Ally. Will you marry me, girl? Her answer was a squeal of pleasure and a kiss she placed on Gus's lips. Hours passed before they remembered to eat dinner. I'm heading out before first light in the morning, Gus said as they got ready for bed after a shower. Going to try for a deer up by that big rock shelf in the next valley. It'll probably be late afternoon or maybe even dusk before I get back. Of course, if I get an animal, I'll be back sooner. As Gus hiked back, his thoughts were on Ally, but the clouds opened up, and a sudden downpour snapped him back to reality. Better get inside, he thought, noticing the weather shift. He stepped onto the back porch, taking shelter from the rain. Gus grabbed a soft, dry towel from a peg on the wall and wiped down his bow and leather quiver. He had crafted the quiver himself from elk hide, and it held a dozen hunting arrows with broadheads for large game. His recurve bow was custom-made by Black Widow Bows in Nixa, Missouri, after months of precise measurements and testing to meet his satisfaction. Gus hung the bow and quiver on pegs along the back wall, letting them acclimate to the room's temperature. He unbuckled his leather belt, which held a small hunting pouch and knife, and hung it as well. After wiping the mud off his boots, he entered the house. Inside, he saw Ally sitting at the kitchen table with her head down, her hair hiding her face. But when she looked up, Gus saw a red handprint on her cheek. He took 2 steps toward her before noticing the 4 armed men standing by the door. The biggest of them held a .45 pistol aimed directly at Gus. That's far enough, buddy, the man with the pistol ordered. He motioned with the gun. Join the little lady at the table. Gus sat down next to Ally after checking she was otherwise unharmed. There's no money to speak of in the house, Gus said calmly. The keys to my truck are in it. Take the truck and supplies, and leave us be. The big man shook his head, smiling. You don't understand the situation here, buddy. He introduced himself and the others. That's Joe, Barry, Jenkins, and I'm Sully. We're your worst nightmare. Gus assessed each man quickly. Joe was gaunt, almost skeletal, with white hair. Barry was short but broad, and Jenkins had a wild look in his eyes. Sully, towering over them all, stood at 6 feet 4 inches, exuding an air of cruelty despite his almost friendly demeanor. So what do you want? Gus asked, his mind racing, thinking of how to protect Ally. Ever read a short story called The Most Dangerous Game? Sully asked. Gus nodded. Ally remained silent. It's about a rich man who hunts another man on his private island, Sully explained. I've hunted every big game in the US, Canada, Alaska, you name it. But I'm bored. After reading that story, I decided I'd hunt a different kind of prey, people. And you two will be my next challenge. Why us? Gus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I scouted a hunting spot outside Fremont back in August, Sully said. When I stopped by the courthouse in Van Buren for a deer tag, I overheard you talking with the service station owner about hunting on your property. He said it was perfect, out in the middle of nowhere. That got me interested, so I did a little investigating. He grinned menacingly. And here we are. Your farm is 50 miles from the nearest town, and the property is posted for no trespassing, so I thought this would be a great out-of-the-way place to try my little experiment. After the hunt, assuming you're successful, I think this is a perfect area to continue our hunts. Sully answered, we will find other candidates and bring them here to continue our little entertainment. That story ends with the hunter becoming the hunted and losing the game in his life. Gus offered, yes, that is the way the story ends, but this is real life, and that won't happen, Sully bragged. The story was about one man hunting another, Gus said, motioning toward the other 3 men. What about them? I wanted to share the thrill of the hunt with my friends, Sully replied. Tomorrow morning at dawn, you will be given an hour's head start, then we will come after you. What about Ally? The young lady will be the prize for the man who kills you, Sully leered at Ally. I certainly hope I am the winner, he laughed and added, of course, if I win, I'll share my trophy with my friends, and I expect them to do the same for me. Gus frowned, but Sully pointed his pistol at him and Ally. None of that now, he ordered. You and the girl get over on the couch. Joe, tie them up. Don't make it too tight, we want our prey to have feeling in his hands and feet. Tomorrow morning, Sully smiled again and added, after all, we want to be sporting. The painfully thin man used a rock climber's nylon rope to first secure Gus and then did the same to Ally. Now I suggest you get some rest, Sully said. The hunt begins at dawn. Will the prey be allowed a weapon? Gus asked sarcastically. I have no intention of one of us getting hurt if you should get lucky, so no, you will be unarmed. Sully, Joe, and Jenkins went through the breezeway to the bedrooms, leaving Barry to guard the prisoners. Gus and Ally watched and talked in whispers. When Barry wasn't paying attention or went to the bathroom, they discussed plans and options, still awake 4 hours later when Joe came to relieve the watch. After Barry left, Joe went to the stove, got the coffee pot, and poured himself a cup. While he was occupied doing that, Gus leaned close to Ally's ear and whispered, no matter what, I will come back for you. Ally looked back at Gus and smiled softly. I know you will, she replied, leaning in closer to Gus and kissing him. Just don't get yourself killed. They're not good enough to catch me, so you do what you have to do to stay alive, and I will come for you. Ally seemed to gain strength from Gus's words and nodded. All too soon, Gus could see the sun beginning to rise. Sully, Joe, and Barry joined Jenkins in the kitchen after getting coffee. Sully pulled his gun and sent Joe to untie Gus. Let him stretch his legs before we send him on his way, he ordered. The hunters allowed Gus to take a long drink of water and pushed him toward the back door. You'll have a 1-hour head start from the time we put you out the door, Sully instructed. We won't watch where you go, but in an hour we will track you down. Gus started to say something to the big man, but Sully held up his hand. You now have 59 minutes. Gus stared at Sully for a few seconds, turned, and stepped out onto the back porch. Sully slammed the door behind him with a grim smile. Gus grabbed his bow, quiver, and hunting belt from the pegs on the outside wall. Good thing they didn't check the back wall, he thought as he left the yard at a ground-covering lope. 10 minutes later, Gus settled behind a huge oak tree on a hill overlooking the valley and the house. The rain had stopped during the night, but the low-hanging dark clouds began to drop a gentle snow about 30 minutes after he had been forced out of the house. Sully, Barry, and Jenkins stepped out onto the back porch. Sully pointed to the path leading up the closest hill, and the men started into the woods. So much for an hour head start and being sporting, Gus thought. If this snow gets heavier, it will be harder not to leave a trail for them to follow. He watched as the men went over the crest of the hill and started down the other side. Gus tightened the ties on his winter weight moccasins, which allowed him to move silently through the woods, and waited a few minutes to make sure the men were gone. He had only seen 3 of the hunters. Joe must have been left behind to guard Ally, Gus thought. Slowly and carefully, he made his way down the hill to the back of the house. Gus took a very quick peek through one window and saw Joe sitting at the kitchen table, facing the front door with his head down as he played solitaire. Ally was still sitting on the couch, staring at Joe, but she wasn't relaxed. Her hands were still tied, but she dropped her feet off the couch to the floor and rushed Joe. As Gus watched, Joe picked up a pistol from the table and backhanded Ally, knocking her to the floor. He pointed the pistol at her head and yelled at her. Gus put an arrow on the string and started toward the door. He was pretty sure he could let an arrow go before Joe could get turned. As he touched the door, Gus heard one of the other men coming back down the trail, yelling over his shoulder that he would get the binoculars. Before Gus could enter the house, a rifle bullet hit the back wall near his head, and immediately afterward, he heard the sound of the shot. Joe turned to face the noise, bringing his pistol to bear on the door. Having lost the advantage, Gus turned and sprinted into the trees near the corner of the house, away from Barry, who was coming down the hill. Joe came out of the house and fired a couple of rounds in the direction of Gus's escape. Gus knew he could have taken one of the men, but he doubted he could handle both of them. If he broke into the door and took Joe down, he would still have Barry and the others to contend with. It would have turned into a siege with him and Ally imprisoned in the house. If he took out Barry, Joe would have had a chance to shoot Gus and definitely time to harm Ally. Even if he did get both of them, they would have to run. Ally was good, but she couldn't keep up with him, and they both would end up captured. There would be another time, he swore to himself. Sully and Jenkins came down the hill, meeting up with Barry and Joe, who had come out onto the porch. "What happened?" Sully asked. First, Joe and then Barry explained Gus's appearance back at the cabin. "Looks like our boy is trying to be clever," Sully said. "Okay, hog-tie the girl and stay alert, Joe. The rest of us will continue the hunt." Pointing at the woods Gus had disappeared into, he directed Jenkins to circle around from the right, and Barry was sent to the left while he took the middle. "Stay sharp, and we'll catch him between us. If you tree him, shoot twice quickly, and the other 2 will come to you. Understand?" Jenkins and Barry nodded and turned to head back into the woods. After a minute, Sully followed directly behind Gus, carrying his rifle at the ready. He thought the prey would run now and try to escape. Sully was wrong. Gus had found a place to watch his pursuers until he knew what they were doing. He saw them split up, and after a few minutes, he followed Jenkins' trail. Gus saw that the hunter was following a game trail, thinking Gus would have used it to gain speed in his escape. Gus looped around Jenkins and got a couple of 100 yards in front of him. The snow had gotten heavier but still wasn't sticking yet except in open areas. He stayed under the trees as much as possible to avoid leaving footprints. There was an 8-foot-tall rotted stump beside the game trail. The dead tree was hollow with just one opening into the interior. Gus pulled out his hunting knife and stepped into the hollow stump, waiting for Jenkins. Jenkins held his rifle in front of him, ready to bring it to bear if he saw his prey. He heard a rustling behind him and turned. Before he could complete the turn, arms circled his neck, and a knife touched his neck. He tried to struggle but was shaken like a rag doll. "Be really quiet now if you want to live," Gus ordered. "Drop your rifle and kick it away." Jenkins hesitated, feeling the knife lightly slide across his neck, leaving a very shallow cut that began to bleed immediately. "Do as I say, or I'll finish the job," Gus added. Jenkins followed orders. Gus kicked the back of Jenkins' knee, and the man dropped to the wet, leaf-covered ground, pushed onto his stomach. His hands were pulled one at a time behind him, and Gus used a zip tie from his hunting pouch to secure Jenkins. He used another tie on Jenkins' feet. Gus pulled Jenkins' feet up and connected his arms and legs together with a third zip tie. "That ought to hold you," Gus offered. He cut 2 long strips from the man's jacket, pushing one strip into Jenkins' mouth and using the other to tie the gag in place. "Don't go anywhere, I'll be back for you," Gus said, patting the man on the shoulder. He picked up the rifle and hit it well off the trail. Gus didn't want to use the gun because it would alert the others. He left, heading east. The light breeze that had come up made more noise than the woods. Barry stopped to catch his breath. The hill he had climbed was steep, with obstructions of brush and downed trees. He sat down on a log after brushing the moss off and took out a cigarette. As he started to light it, he felt a sharp point pushed against the back of his neck. Slowly turning his head, he looked behind him and saw Gus with a hunting arrow pointed at his face. "Toss the rifle," Gus said in a soft voice. Barry did as he was told and was pushed face down onto the ground. His hands, feet, and mouth were secured just as Jenkins had been. Gus hid Barry's rifle as he had done with the first one. "Now I'll go find your friend." Suddenly, Gus heard a rifle shot and the hiss as the bullet just missed his head. He quickly turned and, in one motion, brought his bow up and let the hunting arrow loose. The arrow, a carbon graphite shaft with a razor-sharp broadhead tip, flew from the bow, covering the 40-foot distance in less than 1 second. The impact of the missile just below the breastbone drove Sully to his knees. An arrow protruded from his back through his spine. Sully looked down at the shaft and then up again. He gave a mocking salute and fell over. "No need to tie this one," Gus said, turning and, like a ghost of the woods, slipping through the trees back toward the farmhouse. Gus slipped onto the back porch and peeked into the window. Joe was at the table again but had his back to the wall. He held his pistol, bracing it on the table, nervously looking at both the front door and the back one. Stepping to the side of the door, Gus knocked. He saw Joe jump up and point his pistol at the back door. "Joe, it's Gus. Baylor, Jenkins, and Barry are secured up on the ridge. Sully wasn't as lucky. He's up on the ridge too, but I had to take care of him. I've got the girl." Baylor's voice quivered and rose in pitch. "Joe, if you hurt her, I will make you regret it." Gus responded, "Leave your pistol and come outside. I give you my word I won't hurt you." "What are you going to do to me?" Joe's voice was full of fear. "I'll take you, Barry, and Jenkins to the sheriff," Gus said, waiting a few seconds before speaking again. "Come on, Joe, you can't hold out forever. You've got to sleep sometime." Joe argued, "That's true, but you'll never know when I sleep. All I have to do is check on you now and then." Joe looked longingly at the front door but hesitated. If Sully and the others had been taken by this guy, he thought, I don't stand a snowball's chance in hell. Making up his mind, he laid the pistol on the table, moved away, and got down on the floor. Before he could call out, Gus came through the door with an arrow on the string and the bow pulled back for shooting. Gus let the string go back to rest and picked up the pistol from the table, sticking it in his waistband. He went to the pantry and got 3 more zip ties, having used all he had on Jenkins and Barry. Gus put his knee in Joe's back and secured the man like the others. Then he went to Ally. Using his buck knife, Gus cut the ropes holding her and helped her to sit up. "Are you okay?" he asked. Ally nodded, rubbing her wrists and stretching her legs to get the circulation back. "What about the others?" she asked. "Like I told Joe, 2 of them are hogtied in the woods." Gus gave her a grim smile. "I had to deal with Sully." "Good. The scumsucker got what he deserved," Ally replied. Gus looked closer at Ally. The left side of her face still showed bruising from the first slap, while the right side was swollen. There was a small cut just at the end of her eyebrow, and the ugly colors were obvious. "Let me get a cold towel for your face," Gus suggested and walked to the kitchen sink. As he left her, Ally got to her feet and, limping a little, made her way to where Joe lay on the floor. Drawing back her foot, she kicked him 3 times. "How does that feel, you little? You thought you could use me for your plaything, didn't you?" She started to kick him again, but Gus put his arms around her and pulled her away. "Settle down, young lady," he said with a laugh. "I thought I was the deadly hunter. But I'm really mad. All he talked about was what he and the others were going to do to me." Ally leaned into Gus's arms and asked, "What are we going to do now?" We can't call the sheriff. We don't have a landline phone, something you refuse to allow on the farm, and our cell phones don't get reception out here. We'll take the truck, go to Van Buren, and tell the sheriff what happened. Then he can follow us back and pick up the garbage." Gus grinned and added, "As far as a landline goes, it would cost a fortune to get one installed this far out, and even if we could, I came here to escape civilization, not to bring it with me. I like having electric power, but that's about all I'll stand for. You ready?" Ally nodded. "Then let's go to town." Before they left, Gus wrapped some ice cubes in a towel so Ally could reduce the swelling on her face. "Howdy, Gus." "Hello, Ally," Sheriff Paul Bradley said. "What brings you to town? It isn't your normal day for a supply run." Seeing Ally's face for the first time, he asked, "What happened to your face?" "You best get over to Doc Taylor," Sheriff Bradley said. He knew everything that went on in his town and was upset that a young lady he considered a friend was injured. He had been sheriff for over 15 years, elected when he was 25, and was such a favorite of the people in Van Buren that after a few years nobody ran against him in the elections. He was the exact opposite of the stereotypical country sheriff, over 6 feet tall, with a lean, trim, muscular body. His hair now had a little gray in it, but his eyes were still keen and as sharp as a laser. One look into those eyes made people realize this wasn't a man to cross. "Had some trouble out at my place," Gus answered, explaining what had happened, with Ally chiming in several times. "3 of the 4 men are trussed up back at the farm." "You said there were 4 men. Where's the 4th one?" Bradley asked. "He shot at me, and I had to take care of him," Gus answered. "He's up on the ridge too." "Sounds to me like they picked the wrong man to hunt," Bradley said. "Y'all get Ally over to the docks when you're ready to go back. Me and my deputy will follow you." There wasn't much that Doc Taylor could do for Ally. He examined her, cleaned the cut on her face, and closed it with a small butterfly bandage. "It won't leave a scar, so don't worry. Here's some pain pills if it gets to hurting too bad," Taylor said. "That cold compress is about all we can do, but you're going to look like a raccoon for a spell." Arriving back at the farm, Gus and Ally ignored Joe, who was still hogtied on the living room floor. They made and ate lunch, as neither had had anything to eat since their adventure had begun. "Hey, don't I get something to eat?" Joe asked in a whiny voice. "No, you don't get something to eat. You're lucky you can still breathe," Gus replied. "Shut up until the sheriff gets here." After eating, Gus went into the master bedroom. In the large closet was a hidden door to a gun safe that contained Gus's weapons. He cleaned and carefully unstrung his bow and put it on its holder. Gus took his personal weapon, a Glock 21.45 caliber pistol, the holster designed for it, and clipped it to his belt under his rainproof jacket. He put on a wide-brimmed waterproof hat and started toward the back door. "I'm going to bring Barry and Jenkins down for the sheriff," he explained. "I'll go with you," Ally offered. Gus shook his head, pointed at their prisoner, and handed Ally Joe's 9mm. "Keep an eye on our guest here. If Bradley gets here before I get back, tell him what I'm doing and he'll have more company for him shortly." "You be careful," Ally ordered. "I don't want anything to happen to you." Gus pulled her in for a hug and then went out the back door. He hiked up the ridge to where he left Jenkins. The man was lying on his side, soaking wet from the rain and snow, shivering from the cold. Gus cut the zip tie holding his hands and feet together and cut the one securing Jenkins's feet, leaving his hands tied. Gus pulled back his coat and showed his prisoner his weapon. "You're going to walk down the hill in front of me," Gus said. "If you try anything or try to run, I will shoot you and leave you to rot. Understand?" Jenkins nodded. "Yes." "Say it," Gus ordered. "I understand," Jenkins said. Gus turned him down the hill, and the 2 men slowly made their way back to the farmhouse. Climbing onto the porch, Gus called out, "It's me, Ally." He opened the door and, grabbing Jenkins's arm, drew him into the kitchen. "Sit down next to Joe on the floor," he said. Jenkins awkwardly sat down, and Gus went to the pantry. "Bring out a few more zip ties." "Stick your feet out in front of you," he said to Jenkins. The man did as he was ordered, and Gus zip-tied his feet together and pushed Jenkins against the wall. "What about me?" Joe whined. "Why should I be tied like this while he gets to sit normally?" Gus pulled out his hunting knife, rolled Joe over onto his stomach, and cut the zip tie connecting his feet and hands. "That's as much consideration you're going to get. Don't push your luck." Turning to Ally, he asked, "You okay?" Ally nodded and flinched a little at the pain from where Joe had hit her. "I'm going to bring Barry in. Be back in about an hour." "If they get froggy, shoot him," Gus ordered. He left through the back door and started up the game trail to the left of the house. Barry had rolled up against the log he'd been sitting on. He lost his hat, and his hair was matted down from the wet snow. Gus pushed him over onto his front and cut 2 of the ties, leaving his hands secured behind him. He helped Barry to his feet, showed him the Glock, and pointed back down the game trail. "If you do anything but walk down that trail, I'll kill you," Gus said in a flat, unemotional voice. "Where are you taking me?" Barry asked. "Back to the house to join your friends. The sheriff should be there by the time we get back." Barry slipped on the muddy game trail and fell down. "Careful now, we wouldn't want you to get hurt," Gus said, helping the man to his feet. A large white van could be seen parked in front of the house as the 2 men came down the hill to the back of the house. "Looks like your ride is here," Gus said. He guided Barry into the house and pushed him to the floor next to Jenkins and Joe. "You didn't bring the body of the 4th man down with you?" Sheriff Bradley said. It was both a question and an observation. "Nope, he's up on the ridge just off the game trail," Gus answered. "He should be buried," Bradley suggested. "If you want him, go up the hill and get him. If not, well, the varmints have to eat too." Gus took the cup of coffee Ally offered him. After a few seconds, he turned back to Bradley. "On second thought, I don't want his body on my property. Loan me a deputy and I'll take the ATV up the hill and bring the body down. But we're going to need a body bag. He might be getting ripe by now. Just give the boys directions and the loan of the ATV, and they'll bring him down," Bradley said. "Give me a hand getting these 3 into the van," he requested, freeing their feet one at a time but leaving Joe, Jenkins, and Barry's hands secured. Gus and Sheriff Bradley took them out to the big Ford cargo van. The only seat was the bench seat across the front of the vehicle. Behind the seat were several tie-down points for securing cargo. Bradley handcuffed each man with their hands in front of them and then cut the zip ties. He secured each man to different tie-down rings with more zip ties, leaving them to sit on the floor of the van as best they could. "Hey, I can't ride like this," Jenkins complained. "I could hog-tie you again and just toss you in the back if you like," Bradley replied. Jenkins kept quiet after that. "Where'd you get the van?" Gus asked. "I didn't think Van Buren had more than 2 or 3 patrol cars." "We don't," the sheriff answered. "After I talked to you, I went to the U-Haul place and rented this cargo van." Bradley smiled. "It's not like I'm going to worry about comfort for this bunch." The 2 deputies came back down the hill with the body across the front rack of the ATV. It was zipped up in a body bag. They had removed the arrow because they couldn't zip up the bag with it sticking up. They saved the arrow and left it in the back. Riding the ATV to the back of the van, they opened the 2 rear doors and lifted their heavy cargo into the freight area. "We need to take the time and secure the body so it won't move around on the way back to town," Gus told them. He said he would take the ATV back to the barn, and the deputies climbed into the cab of the van after arguing about who got to ride shotgun. Sheriff Bradley walked over to where Gus was sitting on his ATV. "Glad you and Ally are okay, Gus," Bradley said as he shook Gus's hand. He turned to leave but stopped and turned back to Gus. "Got a question for you, though," he said, nodding. "Those men couldn't have caught you in the woods. You're like a ghost in there. In fact, you could have led them around those hills until they walked off their boots." Gus smiled and nodded again. I know you hung around because of Ally, and that makes me wonder, what do you wonder, Sheriff? You stalked those men, walked right up on 2 of them, and they didn't know you were there. Why didn't you kill all of them? I know you've got the stones, so why didn't you end it all and kill them? Gus draped his right leg across the ATV's tank in front of him and stared across the valley to the woods on the far side. After almost 10 seconds, he turned back to Bradley and answered, I'm a hunter, Sheriff, not an executioner. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.